Good afternoon, and welcome to the Akron Roundtable. I'm Angelina Milo, Board Chair and President of the Akron Roundtable Board of Directors. Akron Roundtable is brought to you today over radio station WKSU 89.7 FM from Quaker Square on the University of Akron campus in downtown Akron, Ohio. The radio broadcast is underwritten by Lehman's. Today's luncheon is co-sponsored by Browse McDowell and Rutzel and Andrus. Thank you both. We're delighted that you are joining us today for part one of our two-part Point Counterpoint series on immigration. Point Counterpoint is a two-part series in which speakers help create a public dialogue around important topics. The luncheons occur in subsequent months, with a different viewpoint being explored on the same topic each month. The goal of these luncheons is to help people learn from each other, foster civil discourse, and build relationships. Please mark your calendars now for our Counterpoint event, Thursday, October 21st, when we will host Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. His topic, Mass Immigration versus Modern Society. To make a reservation for these or any of our Roundtable luncheons, or to purchase a subscription to our luncheon series, please visit our website, akronroundtable.org. Today, it is truly a pleasure to welcome to the Akron Roundtable stage Ali Noorani, Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum. His topic is Room to Grow, Economic Growth and Human Potential in a Changing Nation. I will now invite Madhu Sharma, Executive Director of the International Institute of Akron, to introduce our speaker. Madhu?
Good afternoon. It's so nice to see everybody in person today. Probably the first gathering we've had in a long time. It's good to see all the familiar faces in our community, and I'm so glad that Ali gets to meet each of you and gets to get some sense of what Akron is for immigrants and the very diverse voices we have in our community. I learned of Ali Noorani in 2009 when I watched a documentary film screening of Papers while I was living in Los Angeles. Ali was interviewed and he was featured as an immigration expert in the film, and he discussed undocumented youth in America. His commentary in that film still rings true today, and he doesn't know this, but I have followed his career ever since. And through my work, I've gotten to meet many of his staff who work in rural and remote parts of this country, from California to Texas, DC to Ohio. And I promise you, if you listen closely today, you will learn something new on the topic of immigration, and you might even recognize some solutions that immigration policies could provide to the challenges our own community is facing today. Ali Noorani is the Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum. It's an immigrant advocacy organization that seeks to coalition build across party, faith, and regional divides. He's the son of Pakistani immigrants and grew up in Salinas, California. You may have seen him on almost any leading news network or outlet speaking as an immigration expert and a commentator. He's the author of multiple books and papers on the topic of immigration and the U.S. economy, and is the host of the Only in America podcast. He also has a daily email called Noorani's Notes. I highly recommend you subscribe to it if you want to be in tune with what's happening in D.C. On the topic of immigration. And I think in my world, he has been a leading voice in moderate and conservative circles in U.S. immigration policies. And his unique lens and strategy in advocating for immigrants is respected across all spectrums of the immigration debate. He is with us today to speak about his recent paper, Room to Grow, Setting Immigration Levels in a Changing America. So with that, let's open our minds and put our hands together to welcome Ali Noorani.
Thank you so much, Andu, and I am so really happy to be here with you today in Akron to talk about how the Cleveland Browns are going to be doing this year. You got to know your audience. You always got to know your audience. But really, I so appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. We met earlier this morning at the Chamber of Commerce and just had an incredibly rich discussion about not just the state of play on the issues, but what needs to happen both federally and locally so that we as a nation can once again welcome immigrants and refugees. So I thought we'd start by thinking back to the spring of 2020 and in those first months of the pandemic. And I remember I was in California with my parents helping them through some unrelated health issues, and every single day, kind of after my East Coast driven inbox would settle down, I'd pick up the phone and just call somebody and try to get a perspective of kind of what was happening. And I remember talking to a friend who had just retired from one of the world's leading multinational agricultural companies. He knew how the food system operated, from the point a seed goes into the ground, to harvest, to delivery, to getting a product on the shelf. In each conversation, he would just talk about the value of the immigrant workforce at every step of the way. Another friend I talked to lives in the upper Midwest, not terribly far from here, in a small meatpacking town in rural America, in one of the only counties in this particular state that has seen population growth. And that growth has largely been because of immigrants and refugees. Initially, the two meat processing plants in the town, one for pork and the other for turkeys, were COVID-free. But soon they were hit, and things slowed down. But the company put forward the safety precautions, and the community rebounded, and we as a nation were able to continue to have meat on the table. And I talked to another friend who is in Boston, and he told me about the Central American and the Haitian families that he served at a local health center that were working in nursing homes and health centers across the region to care for others. They were putting their own health at risk in order to care for those who had been hit by COVID-19. But you look back and the data is just incredibly clear. Immigrants are overrepresented in the essential workforce integral to the country's pandemic response. For example, 28% of physicians, 73% of farm workers, 40% of food packers are immigrants. It has been an incredibly difficult year and a half. But imagine how much harder this time would have been without immigrants. And this is the thing. Whatever comes our way as a nation in the future, we need immigrants and immigration to be competitive on the global stage, to get food to the table, and most importantly, to help American families thrive. What puts all of this at risk is the fact that our population is aging dramatically. Fertility rates are falling, life expectancy is rising, baby boomers are reaching retirement age, and net immigration levels are not high enough to keep pace. According to the US Census, nearly 1 in every 4 Americans is projected to be 65 years or older by the year 2060. At that point, 94.7 million people over age 65 will be living in the country, close to twice the number that we have today. The 2020 census found that the nation's population grew only by 7.4% in the last decade. That's the slowest rate of growth for our nation since the 1930s. And experts attributed to this significant drop to decreased immigration, a declining birth rate, and the aging of the country's white population. Now look, U.S. population is projected to grow about 2.3 million people per year through 2030, which feels like a lot, right? But that's going to drop to 1.9 million per year of growth between 2030 and 2040. And it will fall to 1.6 million people per year by 2060. At the same time, there are unfilled openings in crucial industries that everybody in this room understands certainly better than I do, whether it's healthcare, agriculture, manufacturing, information technology. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic brought these into clear relief, as across the country, communities, particularly rural communities, experienced shortages of nurses and physicians, as experienced healthcare providers had retired. Annual warnings from the Social Security Administration reveal a fragile pension system on the brink of insolvency. Depletion of the Social Security system could happen as soon as 2034. And shrinking local tax bases are devastating local communities, impacting their capacity to provide basic infrastructure and adequate job opportunities for their communities. From 2010 to 2020, the population of 65 and older grew by 39%. 39%. Meanwhile, in the same time period, the population of working age adults grew by just 4%. And the population of children did not grow at all. At a national level, the United States risks falling into severe age dependency, characterized again by a failed Social Security system, the inability to provide health care to the elderly, and a stagnant or declining federal or local economies. In rural America, the problems are even worse. 61 million people living in rural areas live in contexts of not just low population growth, but outright population decline. This is the number that gets me every time. 80% of the US population lives in counties that lost working age adults over the past decade. Our population is growing slower and it's growing older. And in Ohio, the situation is no better. According to the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, from 2000 to 2019, the national population grew over 16%, but Ohio's population grew only 2.9%. The department forecasted that Ohio's total population is forecasted to grow just 0.3% in 10 years, and the working age population will only see a growth of 0.5%. Meanwhile, the oldest population in the state, age 65 or older, is expected to grow by 18.4% in Ohio. Just like at the national level, most of the additional 138,000 jobs to be added to the Ohio economy between 2018 and 2028 are expected to be healthcare and social assistance. The picture is pretty clear. So what do we do about this? Now, before I get into the solutions, allow me to digress for just a hot second, because I understand this is a point-counterpoint. So I'm going to jump ahead and counterpoint the counterpoint. And I know Mark, and we've done this before, but never quite a month apart. But next month, I am fairly certain that the counterpoint speaker will point out that many jobs can and will be automated in the future. And he will say, I imagine, we should limit, if not dramatically decrease, the number of immigrants to the United States. Well, yes, I would agree that we need to do a much better job of training the incumbent workforce. Make sure that the workers of today have the skills and the opportunities for the jobs of tomorrow. Absolutely. But I wonder if the workforce itself is shrinking, will training alone solve the problem? And furthermore, when you're talking about healthcare and social assistance and service jobs, these are not jobs that can be automated. In other words, a robot cannot take care of grandma, but an immigrant can. So what do we do? And more importantly, how do we measure what we do? At this point in the conversation, we typically end up in a very complicated discussion of visa programs. Do we need more H-1B high skill? Do we need more H-2A agriculture? Do we need more it becomes this alphabet soup of visa programs. And these are all important issues, right? And I'm happy to talk about them. But in reality, those visa programs and the numbers and the processes and the systems behind them are very far removed from the pocketbook, the checkbook that a family looks at around the kitchen table any one night. So what we did at the National Immigration Forum, and I want to credit my colleague Danilo Zak, is that we looked at the ratio of working age adults to adults of retirement age. And what we decided to do is that rather than looking at this problem and trying to develop a solution based on visa programs, let's look at the problem and solutions through demographics and just sheer population. The ratio that I mentioned, working age adults to retirement age, is called the Old Age Dependency Ratio. Not a very well marketed, branded ratio, I admit, but it's very clear, right? So our analysis led us to believe that as a nation, we have room to grow. In fact, as a nation, as I hope I made the case earlier, we need to grow. After we published the report, Brian Walsh from Axios wrote, "The U.S.'s sharply declining rate of population growth threatens to put an expiration date on a country built around a vision of endless reinvention." And in the New York Times, Farhad Manjoo, a columnist, relied on our report to make the case to stave off the worst effects of slowing growth. We don't need to smash open the borders and let in the whole world. All we have to do is become the same welcoming nation we once were. So allow me to kind of unpack this a little bit. In 1965, the Old Age Dependency Ratio was 6.4 working age adults per adult at retirement age. That's a healthy ratio, right? In 2005, it had come down to 5.4 working age adults per retiree. Today, that number is 3.54 working age adults to retiree. If we were to maintain the current level of immigration to the United States, roughly 1 million people who enter the country through visa programs, work visa or family visa programs, maintain that 1 million. By 2030, our old age dependency ratio would drop to 2.76 working adults to retirees. By 2060, we would be down to 2.37 working age adults to those of retirement age. This demographic decline, given even just where we are now, would lead to economic decline at all levels. There'd be a shrinking tax base, a shrinking workforce, and a shrinking population just of consumers. All at the same time when our society by 2040, 50, 60 would be faced with significant numbers of folks enjoying their golden years. So we looked at this and we said, okay, as an advocacy organization, we could make the case that we need to increase immigration exponentially so that that number gets back to 6.5, right, the way it was in 1965. And then we also looked at, okay, where are we as a nation politically today? What feels achievable? What feels like something that we as a nation can have a compassionate, a rational conversation? What's that number? So we said, okay, what is the number of, how much do we need to increase immigration just to maintain where we are today in terms of 3.54 working age adults to retiree? That feels reasonable, right? Let's try to hold this level. So based on census data, net migration data, life expectancy projections, the fact that people are working longer, but they're also getting more years of education, we believe we need to increase annual immigration levels by 37% to help maintain the current age dependency ratio by 2060. Even then, there will be some peaks and valleys if everything else remains consistent. This 37% increase equals about 370,000 additional immigrants per year. Now, to be clear, we were agnostic for this project of what types of skill levels, right? You know, do we need high skill or agriculture, et cetera? We believe, you know, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the question and answer, but I often feel, I really believe that the more we talk about skill sets of kind of high skill versus low skill, we're placing a value on a person, on an immigrant, and we're treating them as if they were a cog in the economic wheel. In reality, they're people. They're people with families. And I think in the worst case scenario, when we differentiate between high skill and low skill, we also have a tendency to do that to each other. And we say, okay, you work in a low skill job, you're not worth as much. So we really try to think about, okay, we as a nation, we have the largest and the most diverse economy in the world. We need this skilled farm worker just as much as we need the skilled engineer. So that was part of the reason why we didn't delve into kind of the different visa programs. But again, we wanted to try to arrive at a number and go through a process that had the potential to relate to everybody. Besides, a demographic analysis doesn't need to prioritize or discriminate between immigrants who come via employment-based or family-based or humanitarian categories. Instead, the model recognizes that immigrants arriving for different reasons may help combat demographic decline in different ways. So for example, an immigrant who comes for work may be the best equipped to fill labor shortages left by an aging population. Yet an immigrant who comes to reunite with and build a family will actually be addressing and spurring future growth and addressing the demographic problems at their root. And refugees, which we'll talk about more, meanwhile tend to resettle in less dense population centers, reinvigorating communities that are already bearing the brunt of demographic deficit. Although setting an immigration level based on the Old Age Dependency Ratio does not set priorities among immigrants or immigration systems, there are ways to reform platforms that could reform this approach to better respond to demographic decline. Possible policy reforms include increasing non-immigrant pathways for in-demand occupations, in essence, work visas for such occupations such as healthcare or elder care or home care, prioritizing a younger immigrant population overall, or targeting immigration flows to areas that will be hardest hit by demographic decline. But ultimately, the policy question is not hard to solve. It's the political question and trying to help the American public see what is in it for them, how increasing immigration can help them and their families thrive. Engaging and persuading Americans skeptical of immigrants and immigration requires an approach that balances the data of economic growth with the values of human potential. When we used to see support for increased immigration of party lines, while we used to see increased support for immigration, Democrat or Republican, the fact is now that support breaks down by partisan lines. According to the Cato Institute, nearly half of Democrats support an increase in immigration, compared to just 21% of independents and only 11% of Republicans. Furthermore, those who seek lower levels of immigration are less likely to have a college education, likely to earn less than $100,000 per year, and more likely to live in less populated areas. According to the Economic Policy Institute, these are also the Americans less likely to have access to a 401k retirement account, therefore more likely to depend on a solvent Social Security system, and more likely to depend on nursing home and other health care as they age. So my point here is that we need to create the opportunities to not just increase immigration, but we need to create the opportunities to increase support for immigration, which brings us to the here and now. Earlier this year, when President Biden announced the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, we raised the alarm. Immediately, we saw that the Special Immigrant Visa Program, the program that allowed Afghan nationals who helped our military to apply for legal entry to the U.S., immediately we saw that program had been decimated, and there was a waiting list of about 18,000 applications. And these were the people, again, who helped our military. We also saw that our refugee system, in spite of the amazing work of organizations like the International Institute, was really at bare bones capacity. But that in addition to a pending humanitarian crisis of the proportions we are now seeing, there was also an opportunity to engage a broad swath of Americans. Because remember, the same Republicans who support increases of immigration at roughly the number I gave was around 20% or less, 1 in 4 Republican households include a veteran or have a veteran in their family. So this was an opportunity I felt from the get-go for the Biden administration to rally the United States across partisan lines, across regions, to say we as a nation fought shoulder to shoulder in Afghan with our allies, and that we have an opportunity, if not a responsibility, to welcome them here as they flee the Taliban. But as we've all witnessed over the last month, none of this happened, in a good way at least. But with the assistance of U.S. veterans and community-based organizations and faith leaders, and I imagine a number of you in this room, tens of thousands have been able to flee Afghanistan. Today, they wait at military bases across the country and around the world while their backgrounds are vetted by national security experts. And soon they'll be welcomed into communities from Alaska to Indiana to South Carolina to here in Akron. There was a poll last week from NPR Ipsos that lays out kind of the roadmap, or lays out the challenges that we face ahead, but also the incredible opportunities that we face. For Democrats and independents in this particular poll, COVID-19 ranked as the most worrisome topic of the day, reverting to their pre-Trump norm when immigration was not a priority. For Democrats and independents, immigration was really at the bottom of the list of priorities, public policy priorities. Among Republicans, however, the pandemic fell behind terrorism and immigration as the most worrisome. In other words, fears about the impacts of immigration, according to this poll, animates Republican voters. And those fears are legitimate, let me be clear. Those fears they're heartfelt, they need to be answered, and they're based on security, on culture, on the economy. So how do we help people address those fears and bring people to a more constructive position on immigration? Because there's an opportunity here, because the same poll points out that 64% of Republicans support the resettlement of Afghans who fear repression or persecution from the Taliban. Over 70% of Republicans support admitting Afghans who worked with the United States government. I've worked in immigration longer than I like to admit. I have never seen this kind of support for one particular immigrant community across partisan lines. Yet, just over 40% of Republicans support the admission of those fleeing Central America, Africa, Libya, or Syria. So there's dissonance, right? But there's something unique about this moment in time and the relationship that we as a country have with the Afghans who are fleeing persecution. Look, as a friend told me a couple weeks ago, he said, politics is about events. And, in DC, we have a tendency to kind of be very focused on kind of the legislative strategy and kind of the blocking and tackling happening on the Hill, while the rest of the country is reacting to an event. Right now, the country is reacting to the event of Afghans coming to the United States for protection. So for our part, we aren't going to step away from pushing for legislative opportunities to protect dreamers, farm workers, temporary protected status recipients. Nor are we going to take our eye off the long game to increase immigration to the United States. But in the here and now, we want to do everything we can to ensure that the resettlement of Afghans is not only broadly supported, but sets the stage for other populations as well. And through this national experience that is rooted in community experience, like here in Akron, we can develop a new story about American immigration. One that understands what people are worried about this moment, questions about security and vetting, questions about the economy, questions about are people going to learn English? But we can understand those questions and we can answer those questions and we can lay out the foundation for a long-term strategy that addresses our demographic challenges that we face as a country. So, what does this look like in practice, right? Because you can talk about this stuff and kind of put a lot of numbers on the table and say, this is what we should do, kind of in a big picture way. But on the ground, what does this look like? Well, and I know this is happening here. You've got veterans groups, you've got churches, you have the International Institute, you have community-based organizations across the country who are organizing themselves, resources, and volunteers in anticipation of the arrival of Afghan families. In fact, in August, Mayor Horgan said, and I found this incredibly powerful, he said, for generations, immigrants and refugees from across the globe have come to Akron in hopes of a better life and a brighter future. Many of us were raised on the stories of the optimism and apprehension our ancestors experienced as they embarked on a new and uncertain future in a foreign land. The life of a new American can be challenging, but America is a land of opportunity, and Akron has long been a city of innovation and industry, where creative and hardworking men and women could learn, work, and raise a family. And now I would argue we are faced with this opportunity where these hardworking families are from Afghanistan. But we should keep in mind that the opposition is growing to Afghan resettlement. And the opposition is growing to rethinking the way we approach American immigration. Those who worked in the Trump administration are planting seeds in the minds of the American public around security questions, about who is here, should they be here? A couple days ago in Michigan, the Proud Boys started distributing, quote, Afghan hunting permits. Look, this could very well become very, very tense in the months and the years ahead. But in the short term, we need to win this debate. We need to help each other, our neighbors, our friends, our families, understand what the short-term needs are of Afghan families and how those needs serve our long-term interests as a nation. So, coming back, right? If we as a country need to increase immigration 37% in order to maintain where we are now, we could be very well seeing an additional anywhere between 75 and 150,000 Afghans over the next year. That begins to, get us closer to that number. But again, this is not just about increasing immigration. It is about increasing support for immigration. That is really, I would argue that is even more important than the numbers and the data and the policy. It's really the creating the community spirit that welcomes. So along those lines, let me close with the 3 things that I think we need to keep in mind. Number 1, we are all human beings. None of us are perfect. Whether our families have been here for generations or our families fled the Taliban and have endured a trauma that is beyond understanding, each one of us will have our assumptions, our fears, our anger. Empathy for our fellow people, wherever they're from, will get us through this moment. Second, and I've said this a couple times, we have to give people who are worried about immigration a place to go that is compassionate and not extremist. And the resettlement of Afghans provides that opportunity. By creating experiences for the community to participate in resettlement through churches, through organizations, through veterans organizations, we can begin to provide a place of compassion for Americans to understand the value of immigration today and into the future. And then finally, this is my ask of everybody in this room, is to tell your story. Tell your story to the people at the table, tell your story tonight at the kitchen table, tell your story at church this weekend. We all have a story of how immigrants have helped us. Perhaps it was our parents or our grandparents who were immigrants. Perhaps it is our doctor, our favorite restaurant, our child's friend at school. We've all come to know and love a Maria or a Muhammad. This is our opportunity to help our friends, our neighbors, see that the Maria or the Muhammad that they don't know is exactly the same person. Because this is more than our moral responsibility to Afghans who seek safety, to Latinos who seek economic opportunity, or anyone else who wants to own the American dream. It's about the ability of the American worker and their family to thrive. Because we don't just have room to grow, we need to grow. And the only way we can do that is together. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ali, for such a powerful and informative message. Our speaker has graciously agreed to respond to questions. Fellow Akron Roundtable Emeritus Director and Attorney at Browse McDowell, David Hunter, will moderate the Q&A session. David?
Thank you, Ali, for inviting all of us to tell our story, and thank you for telling your story to us today. And let's start off with this question. Our country is poorly informed on just exactly what our immigration policy is. The media focuses on the optics of immigration, be it, what we were witnessing in Afghanistan and in other media images, but it neglects to tackle and explain what our underlying policy actually is. Why is that? And how can we inspire media to offer a series of tutorial serials on this to educate all of us?
Thank you. And this is the first Q&A I've done in person for a while, so if I get any tough questions, I'm just going to say my internet went out. I think the most important part of kind of understanding the immigration policies is for the media to be telling the story of the broken immigration system through the stories of folks who are trying to go through the system. And in fact, that's what we're seeing more and more these days with the evacuation and then trying to resettle Afghans here, is that it's bringing into very clear relief how broken that system is. So, I think, you can go to immigrationforum.org and get there's no lack of fact sheets and explainers around all your different immigration policies. But I think through journalism, there's a real opportunity to tell the stories of a system that needs reform through the stories of people who are caught in this broken system.
Here's a question dealing with the issue of immigration that's legal and immigration that's not legal. What is the role of illegal immigration in political opposition to the immigration advocated by today's speaker?
So it's interesting because you know, I started with the 73% of farm workers are foreign-born. Well, many estimates will say that anywhere between 60 and 75% of farm workers are undocumented. You know, we often talk about dreamers and, you know, the fact that, you know, they're high-achieving young people who have contributed to our economy in so many ways. They're undocumented. So, you know, the question of legality gets wound into this in so many different ways that it's hard to differentiate at times. But ultimately, you know, from our perspective, the policy solution for the undocumented is that we are requiring the undocumented to register for legal status, pass certain criteria, meet certain criteria, such as a criminal background check showing that folks are paying taxes, that they are making efforts to learn English, and then going through what's usually proposed as anywhere between a 7 and 12-year process to then become citizens. So people are getting to the back of the line, by no means skipping to the front of the line. But keep in mind that that only solves a part of that demographic problem, because these are people already here, right? They're already working in one way or another in nearly all cases, because there's no access to programs or services. So if we're going to talk about demographic growth and how our economy is going to grow in the long term, yes, legalizing the undocumented so that they can own the American dream as citizens is part of that. But ultimately, the solution really lies in reforming our legal immigration systems so that we as a nation, you know, can get the talent that we need.
Increasingly, so many of the highly educated and respected specialists we see on the evening news programs clearly have immigration-type backgrounds, be it medicine, economics, innovation, people working at Silicon Valley. How do we springboard off that to help promote a nation that cultivates immigrant acceptance?
You know, I don't think it's about the person on TV. And I think we have a tendency to kind of look at that person on TV and say, you know, they started X tech company or X Fortune 500 company. From my perspective, this is about, you know, the person who is served our food, who cleans this building after we leave, who has a small business in a neighborhood of Akron, who is creating, you know, 5 jobs. That's where I think those are the stories that we have to do a better job of lifting up and making a part of the conversation. Because, you know, I can't relate to the CEO who founded the Fortune 100, 500 company. I can't relate to that person. But I can have a conversation with the immigrant business owner who, you know, scrapes resources together and said, I'm going to start this business and I'm going to employ 5 people and my kids are going to go to college. That's the person I want to talk to. That's the person that I think most Americans will relate to.
A member of our audience has this, I'd call it a labeling question. Why do we have to say immigrant? Why can't we say Americans? Maybe losing titles would improve our feelings about those who are different, those who are new, those who are helping.
I think that's a really important point, and oftentimes I'll try to say new Americans, and I think you know, a former board chair once said to me, like, do we want people renting the American dream as immigrants or owning the American dream as Americans? And so I would certainly agree.
We have a great number of questions here. Here's one of them from the audience. Those opposed to immigration argue that immigrants are a drain on safety nets and social services. Is this true?
One of our most popular, so every week I get a report from our team that says, okay, which are the top 5 pages on our website? Week after week, I want to say for like 2 or 3 years, our fact sheet on access to public benefits is number 1 in terms of most read fact sheet. And the fact is that Immigrants, when they enter, and until they've been here for a certain amount of time, do not have access to most, if not most, federal programs and services. Now, states will have different rules in different places, and oftentimes what you'll see is that opposition will say, well, immigrants are drains on public services, but you kind of peel back one layer of the onion, that's because kids are going to school. And what they're saying, they're kind of throwing that into the formula, which then skews the situation. I would argue pretty strenuously that if there's one thing that we want to make sure that happens is that every kid is in a school in the United States. So short answer is no, people are not eligible for most public programs and services until they've been in the country a certain amount of years, or if, let's say they come as a refugee, they'll have access to some services. And in the end of the day, the native born uses public programs and services at a rate greater than immigrants. But that's what programs and services are there for, is to help people.
We have time for a couple more questions. Perhaps you could give us an update on two items that's being addressed by Congress. One is the DREAM Act, providing a pathway for undocumented youth to obtain citizenship, and the other one would be DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. If you could give us an update on where those stand, it would be appreciated.
Sure. When I was writing the speech, I wasn't, it's hard to kind of do these big talks and say, this is what's happening right now. So this is what's happening right now. Earlier this year, there was a bipartisan effort to pass the DREAM Act in the House. That worked. The American Dream and Promise Act legalized dreamers as well as temporary protected status recipients, got to the Senate. Up till I would say about June, there were bipartisan conversations in the Senate around a similar solution. Then Democrats moved to try to utilize the budget reconciliation process as a way to legalize dreamers and DACA recipients, as well as farm workers and temporary protected status recipients. This is all going to start to come to a head over the next few weeks. The Senate parliamentarian, the individual who will say whether or not immigration measures that legalize and protect dreamers, farm workers, and temporary protected status recipients, the Senate parliamentarian will make the final determination of whether or not they can be included. The first conversation with the parliamentarian was on Friday. There will be multiple conversations. Hopefully she will provide an answer to Senate Democrats probably in the next 4 to 6 weeks, maybe sooner, maybe later. This is the thing. If they're successful in including immigration provisions through budget reconciliation, it is a tremendous sigh of relief for dreamers, farm workers, and others who will be protected. But it is a deeply partisan process. So I think that for those of us in the room who will breathe a sigh of relief alongside those dreamers, our voices in supporting them politically is going to be incredibly important. If the parliamentarian says, no, you can't include them, then we'll be back to a bipartisan push, and your good Senator Portman hopefully will continue to be a large part of those conversations.
Okay. We have time for 2 more questions. The presence of youngsters at the border is really a difficult thing to look at. How do we as a country deal with that?
That's a great question. There's a lot going on, man. So over the course of the Trump administration, in spite of efforts to shut the border, in spite of efforts to really try to leverage Mexico and Central America, we continued to see record numbers of families and unaccompanied children to the southern border. Those numbers dropped once COVID-19 really shut movement down, but those numbers clearly have started to increase over the course of this year. I just saw August numbers were released from the border just last night, and I want to say that those numbers have stayed consistent, if not dropped slightly. To a large degree, those drops to date in the month of August are due to the heat in Mexico and Central America. It just makes movement much harder. But also that Mexico has hardened, if not increased their security along their southern border. What is happening now is that those numbers are increasing as Smuggling networks are working their way around as, frankly, the weather starts to lift a little bit. I think the solution here, I would argue, takes 3 or 4 different tracks. One is there needs to be a long-term investment in Central America to address root causes of migration. We need to root out corruption. We need to incentivize private investment in these countries and their economies. And we need to really kind of move forward with violence prevention measures. In Honduras in 2016, there was a purge of the Honduran National Police that ended up removing almost half of the police force, roughly about, I want to say, 3,000 to 5,000 police officers, from the top all the way to the bottom. In the same time period that purge took place and corruption was being rooted out of the Honduran National Police, you saw the homicide rate plummet. So you can address violence and corruption in Central America with an investment. Under the Trump administration, once President Trump said, okay, this is no longer a priority to me, you saw corruption return, you saw the homicide rate increase, and then you saw migration north increase. So that's one piece. Second is actually having legal immigration programs that Central Americans can apply for. The agricultural program, service sector visa programs. These are skill sets that Central Americans can fit right into and really serve our economic needs across the country. And then third, along the border, we need to make sure that there are the immigration judges and the asylum officers, as well as the infrastructure to facilitate the movement of people so that those who are applying for asylum can have their cases heard. I'm not saying that every person who applies for asylum should receive it, but they should be able to go through a fair process.
Today, you've shared with us your views on what a reasonable and balanced immigration policy might look like. Here's the tough question. What has to happen for Congress, both sides of the aisle, to embrace a reasonable and balanced immigration policy? That'll be our final question. Thank you.
Thank you. You were telling me earlier that you're a track and field announcer?
Yes.
I feel like this is a track and field meet, me just running up, answering questions, running back. So what do we do? So I want to point out my colleague, Christy Statz, who many of you in the room may know, but she is, and I would not just say this if Christy was in the room, but she's probably she is the best organizer we have on staff at the National Immigration Forum. Our strategy as an organization is to engage conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, and business leaders. The coalition that Christy is a part of and helps drive is called Bibles, Badges, and Business. So what do we need to do? Our value proposition is that if you hold a Bible, you wear a badge, or you own a business, you want a common sense solution to the immigration system. So that means that if you fit in any one of those 3 categories, engaging your member of Congress, your senator, your mayor, your city councilor, so that they are public policy voices who are saying, you know what, my voters, Republican, Independent, and Democrat, they want a constructive solution to immigration, one that balances our values of as a nation, that keeps us safe, and that helps our economy grow. So it kind of comes back to what I was saying at the end, telling our respective stories and engaging in this conversation even though it at times feels complicated and tense and difficult. We all have an immigration story, whether it's personal or through the relationships we have. Just by sharing it, we can help change somebody else's mind. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Stay up here for a second. Ali, thank you so much for being with us today. On behalf of the Akron Roundtable, I'd like to present to you this work of art. It is exclusively designed for Akron Roundtable by Akron artists on drum. Thank you again. Thank you. And thank all of you for joining us today. Please join us next month in October. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, and have a great day. Oh, such a pleasure.